Autumn has autumned, but before we get cozy with our cable knit jumpers, our dark academia books, and our pumpkin spice lattes, we are going to wrap up August. I read 7 books. I DNF'd 1, but I am going to count it as a book read, and I will tell you why in a second. Let us grab a drink. I have a coffee today. So welcome back to my channel, fellow bookworms, or welcome if you're new here. It's always lovely to have you, and I would love for you to subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. So the first book I read and finished was actually an audiobook for The Lost Apothecary, and that's by Sarah Penner. I gave this a 3-star because I didn't feel that invested in the story, and it's such a shame because this is interconnected stories, which I tend to love, especially if it's set across different timelines. So this one, for example, we have 2 POVs set in the 1800s and 1 POV in present day, and these run parallel to each other. As this one story unfolds in the past, it brings us closer to answers in the present day. I love the idea of the underground apothecary, which is what this book is about. So we have our apothecary who dispenses poisons, but she only helps women, and she usually helps them when there is abuse or sort of sexual assault. She is always helping instead of harming. But I just felt, in terms of execution, it fell really short. And I obviously can't get too into it without spoiling things, but even though I loved seeing one of her actions have severe consequences, and that kind of literally knocking on in a domino effect and causing the present day timeline story to begin, I really like that connection of it, but I just thought it was a bit boring. It didn't draw me in. I also thought that the present day, even though I really liked, again, seeing that connection of the past and present, I didn't feel as though her story was necessary. And saying that, it was a story about sort of finding herself and discovering who she is without like the manipulation of her husband. So there were like a lot of talking points in terms of toxic relationships, how men's actions affect women. It was interesting in that way. I just wanted a little bit more of it. I wanted to be drawn in. I wanted to be itching to get back to the story, and I just didn't feel that at all. One thing I liked about it was the power of friendship, even when it's unlikely friendship, and seeing how fierce women become when they found their people. Seeing them sacrifice for each other is so beautiful. So there were certainly positive points and things that I did enjoy about this. Don't think I was quite as enticed by it as I thought I would be. The next thing I finished in August was Yellowface by Rebecca F. Kuang. I buddy read this with a couple of friends and really enjoyed it. I gave this one a 4.25. Now, I don't think I need to talk too much about what this book is about because it is so talked about and known. But we basically have this disgruntled writer, Juniper Hayward. It's first person, so we're in her head constantly, which is hard. She has this frenemy, Athena, who is successful, and we see this professional envy. And actually, I think it goes further than just professional. But we see her being extremely jealous of Athena because we constantly talk about how beautiful Athena is, how easy everything is, and how naturally things come to Athena. What a brilliant writer she is. So it isn't just about her writing, it's just about Athena as a person. And even though Athena is this thorn in Juniper's side, she wants to be around her. She wants to orbit Athena. And I think that's a really funny thing about this book. Anyway, so we see Juniper and Athena in Athena's apartment one night, and Athena chokes and dies. And this isn't a spoiler because it's in the synopsis. Juniper does try to save her. I will just say that so we're not all thinking she's just stood back and watched this woman die. She does try to save her, but it can't be done. Somewhere between Athena dying, the ambulance showing up, and June ending back up in her own apartment, she manages to take Athena's unpublished manuscript. Now, because Athena was a very guarded and private writer, no one knows about this and hasn't been announced. It cannot be traced back to Athena, essentially. June starts out trying to finish this manuscript, and what she starts to see is like that she works really well in that format, that she isn't necessarily a writer who can come up with a best-selling idea herself, but she is certainly talented. So she kind of finishes this manuscript and sells it as her own. And what follows is just June making one bad decision after the other. She is just constantly picking the wrong fork in the road. She's just faced with opportunities to be remorseful, to make things right, to admit what she has done. But she just sees the end game as like how much money she is going to make, that she could practically step into Athena's shoes and you start to see her be really successful. Even though there are moments where you can see she is maybe the tiniest bit remorseful, she constantly takes one step forward and two steps back. She'll doubt her decisions, pretending that this is her book, but she's too greedy. And I think that is the thing almost that frustrated me more about this character, is like her constant need for more. She is just insatiable. She does not ever want to stop. You'll see her be successful. She'll be on the bestseller list, which we think in the beginning that's what she wants. But when she gets there, she wants the next thing. She wants a movie deal. When she gets that, she wants the next thing. And it's just constant. She just does not stop. And I think it is a point of validation for her, because we do have scenes with her family where she doesn't get that from them. She doesn't seem to have a support system. And this obviously isn't a defense for June. I do not think she is a good person and she makes terrible decisions throughout this book, but I am trying to see it from her perspective, and I think in a way, maybe even a subconscious way, she is constantly seeking the approval that she is not getting from her family online and in fans and through critic reviews, and she's constantly looking for that, and that's the only way June feels somewhat good about herself. And then when that kind of dies down, you see her itching for the next thing. She wants to be bigger. She wants to be remembered. She just goes about it in literally the worst possible way. And I think that was a source of frustration for me, because obviously, yes, she is racist and she does have bias, like I think unconscious bias even, and she has these there's just a lot going on with this character, because obviously, yes, she is white, like it's important to the story to know that she is white, and she has stolen this manuscript from an Asian American woman. I think something else I noticed about June as a character was that she tends to make herself feel better about her decisions by assuming the worst in other people. You see her often like jump to conclusions about what people are thinking. You see that behavior, that kind of like defensiveness, often like have serious repercussions, and she doesn't even think of those consequences. June is an incredibly flawed and frustrating character. But even still, I think June is essentially the lens that you see the publishing industry through. You see them push June into these decisions, which of course she can kick back on. She can say no. But June, as I've just said, is someone who just sees the dollar sign. She is just thinking of the money she's going to make. She's thinking of the glory she'll have most of all, and I don't think it's maybe touched on that often. She genuinely just wants to be a successful writer. As a spoiler-free example, that they encourage her to use her second name, which is Song, and it isn't because she has any sort of Asian heritage. It's because her mother was a hippie and she thought it would be cool, I guess, to name her kid Juniper Song Hayward. So we see her go from June Hayward to Juniper Song, which instantly sounds like she could possibly have Asian heritage, things like that, where we see this marketing team and editor and agent constantly position June and the book and themselves where they're not doing anything wrong. They're not using a white author to tell a marginalized community story. It's like they're constantly positioning things so that they're in the best position to make a ton of money but not look like they're the bad guys. And I think that was a really valuable part of this book. It is such a critique on the publishing industry. We see Rebecca often talking about kind of tokenism, having these Asian American authors, and it's almost like you can only have one. And if you have one, that's okay. And if you push that one to be the best-selling author, then, you know, you've done your part. Kind of this constant feeling of like celebrating token authors, but you're not supporting them. And also only if this person is obviously like a prodigy, if they're like amazing. So in Athena's case, she is an incredible writer, was an incredible writer. And so, you know, then that works for the publishing industry. And I think it's a really interesting book because a lot of people do seem to get stuck on Juniper, and I can see why, because she is incredibly frustrating and she just makes very poor decisions. But I think we need to shift that perspective slightly to look at what the industry is doing instead. We often have that discourse around who is allowed to tell stories. I could always kind of see both sides of the argument. If we are all just allowed to tell a story that only we have ownership of, that like limits everyone a lot. But I also see how harmful it can be if you allow an author, especially when it comes to race, because race is such a tricky thing, and your race determines your entire life. Your lived experience changes like exponentially when you're a different color. We would like for it not to, but it's the reality of the world we live in. And I think it is so harmful to take a person who is in a privileged position, i.e. a white woman, and then allow her to tell a story from the perspective of a Chinese immigrant who is essentially treated as a slave in the war. The book, again, poses both sides of the argument, and it does so very well. So yeah, I think this is such an interesting book, and I think it is almost for me more of like a think piece. Even though this was a page turner, I was so addicted to like the drama, and it is like a lot of people have pointed this out, but it's that kind of car crash effect where like you don't want to look but you also can't not look. There were also like moments towards the end of this where things took a bit of a turn that I wasn't expecting, and I really enjoyed that. That really made me sit up and pay attention. But yeah, I like this. I have spoken way too long about this book now. I think it's worth analyzing and critiquing because it is such a valuable book in terms of not only, obviously, like I said, race, but also the industry and how problematic that still is. The next thing I finished was Promises and Pomegranates by Sav R. Miller. This was my Smut Salon pick for the month, and I was really excited for this book because this is very loosely inspired by Hades and Persephone. Obviously, if you make that slightly spicy, we're not going to say no. Unfortunately, though, I think this isn't quite what I thought it would be. I liked certain aspects of it. I liked the plot, which is essentially this doctor turned gun for hire. He is involved with this mob and essentially convinces this mob boss to let him marry his daughter, who he has, I'm not quite sure if he's been in love with her for a long time or if he's just had a bit of like an obsession with her, I'm not too sure. And I like the characters individually, even though I didn't watch the full series, but it gave me a Dexter vibe, this doctor using his skills for kind of unsavory business. And I like that it then almost goes on to be this bodyguard situation, and there's forced proximity because he forces her into marrying him, and they kind of ship off to this little island. You can see the beats where it does draw from the Hades and Persephone myth. So there were certainly things I enjoyed about this, and some of this like spice I also liked. Some of it felt to me very demeaning. I want to make this perfectly clear that it is consensual. The sex is almost used as a tool to belittle our female character. And I don't think that was intentional, but I felt like a lot of it was demeaning and I didn't enjoy that aspect of it. I am not a long time smut girly. For me, this is sort of a new experience, and a friend of mine did note that a lot of those kind of mob romances does have that feel where like a demeaning dynamic, but I just didn't enjoy that. Our female character was trying to take some of the power back, again in parallel to the myth. Starts out almost a little bit innocent, but also not really. There's like a lot of stuff going on, guys, but she almost starts out innocent and then becomes spiteful, I want to say, but only in like a sexual exploit. So I don't think this was necessarily the book for me, but because I felt that the plot still felt fairly strong, and even though like I didn't particularly like their chemistry, I also didn't really feel like they had that much chemistry. Like I wasn't completely sold on them as a couple anyway. And then we have some revelations later on in the book where you're also like, hang on, like I'm not too sure I'm like shipping these two at all. But still, I like their individual characters and I like the story, what the story is trying to do, and it was also well written. I feel like this was one of the first dark romances where it wasn't entirely focused on the spice and it was relying on the spice to carry this book. The next thing I finished in record time, because I really, really enjoyed it, was Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett. I loved this book. This was exactly what I like in books, and I see not everyone enjoying this. It is a very me story. It ticks all the little boxes on like tiny little things that I really enjoy in books. For one, it is slow. If you are looking for a fast-paced book, this isn't it. Not a lot of people enjoy quiet stories, but for me, that's one of my favorite things. Like, I don't need much plot. I just want a story where not even a lot happens. I just want it to be beautifully written, and oh my gosh, does this tick the box on that. I think Heather Fawcett's writing is phenomenal in this. There were so many little instances where I just had to take a moment to appreciate the prose because it's so lyrical, but without being too flowery. There is like always that fine line between overly writing and describing and just writing like a beautiful story, and she does that so well. Just very quickly, if you don't know what this is about, we follow Emily Wilde, who is a Cambridge professor, and she is compiling this Encyclopaedia of Fairies where she's worked so hard to find all of this information and put it into her encyclopedia. The last little bit of research she needs is in this little Danish village. So she travels there on her own, but instantly you can see Emily is just in over her head. Like, she does not do well with people, and that's something that like I think a lot of introverts will relate to, is she is socially inept, not even awkward. She just doesn't understand social constructs. Like, she doesn't know how to conduct herself when there are other people around. And I love that about Emily. She isn't grumpy, but I think if we were to assign a trope to this, it would be Grumpy Sunshine, because she is work focused. She's just there to get on with things. She doesn't want to mess around with like being nice. She doesn't want to make friends. She just wants to do her job. And I really, really like Emily as a character. Her Cambridge colleague, Wendell Bambleby, which, judging by his name, that should tell you what kind of person Wendell is. He is just, he's so useless. He literally just bumbles around. He has everything done for him. He's a useless human, but he is so charming, like incredibly so. So we see Bumblebee mentioned, and then eventually when he does show up, we're just like, yes, this is amazing. What follows is essentially the two of them trying to piece together this last little bit of information they need so they can publish not only Emily's Encyclopaedia, but also a paper. This book I loved, again, for so many reasons. The fact that it is just like a slow, quiet story with beautiful writing is one of the reasons I loved it. The fact that Emily is just so relatable in terms of how insufferable she finds human beings is another reason I loved it. I also love the slow burn. Will they, won't they feeling. I just love when characters are really oblivious. Like, they're very smart people, and in Emily's case, she is incredibly intelligent and she is so learned in the way of the folk and Fae. She knows so much about fairy, and that's another thing I love about this, is like all of these little creatures we see around, but she is so oblivious to like human emotion, and I just love that. I can't stop talking about this book because it just genuinely made me smile. And even though I wouldn't think of this as cozy fantasy, there were still pretty high stakes. Even if it doesn't take up too much of the book, there is certainly a part where you're like, this is do or die. This is very important. So I wouldn't say it's cozy fantasy, but they're in this like Scandinavian village where they're kind of snowed under. And we have this tiny little cottage where you need to keep the fire burning and you need to drink a lot of tea. There is an element of coziness to it, and it does feel obviously quite like academic too. For one, it is written as a journal. Two, there are like footnotes that kind of reference other source material. And also Emily's way of kind of communicating, and because obviously it's seen from her perspective, is very academic. It does have that feel to it, but not in like a dark academia way. This, I would say, is more like light academia. I really enjoyed this, and we obviously also make a few discoveries throughout this book that's really important to the next book. And so I'm just like so excited for book 2, and I cannot wait to return to these characters. This book also has like fairy tales within the book, and I love books where there's stories within stories, and this features an amazing pet companion. So many boxes ticked. I just love this. The next book I finished was Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman, which kind of coincided with the release of season 2 of the show, which is perfect timing because now I want to go back and rewatch season 1 and then watch season 2. So this was my round robin, but I have really wanted to read this book for a long time, especially now that I am a new Neil Gaiman stan. I wanted to work my way through his bibliography anyway, so this would have come up eventually, but it's just been expedited a bit. I will say that I watched season 1 of the show a while ago when it first came out, and even though I have the memory of a goldfish and I do not remember anything really ever, I did remember some things. So as I was reading this, there were moments where I would have little glimpses of the show, and it made me feel incredibly intelligent. So I love that. I think if I had read this book blind, I would have enjoyed it even more than I did. I think knowing that certain things weren't as they appeared, or I think characters that were meant to be more mysterious than they were because I had knowledge of who they were. Still, I really loved this, and I gave it a 4.5. It was satirical, it was witty, it was so British. I think that was one thing also where like I maybe didn't connect as much. I think it's still a great book. It doesn't matter where you're from or who you are, but I can see how if you grew up in Britain, how this would appeal to you even more, because there are a lot of niche British things happen in this, or even just in conversation, that I think I would have appreciated so much more if I didn't grow up in a different country. So I really liked it. Like I said, it was incredibly witty, and it does have that like silly fantasy feel to it. I always go back to referencing this author, but when I first got into reading in South Africa, I read a lot of Robert Rankin's work, and he is a British author who is very witty. We're writing fantasy, but we're not taking ourselves too seriously, and I think this gave me a very similar feel. If you haven't seen the show and you haven't read the book and you're not sure what it's about, we have a few interconnected stories, which again I love, and we have brilliant characters. Like I really enjoyed the characterization in this book. We have a witch who is descended from Agnes Nutter, who prophesies Armageddon. Then we have a witch hunter, I guess is the easiest way to explain it, or witch finder is technically what it is. We have a demon and an angel who should be more opposed to each other than they are in this book, and I love that about it. And then we have the Antichrist. And essentially, all of these forces are trying to prevent the end of the world. I can't actually talk about this book without giving anything away, but what I will say is that we essentially have a boy who is just trying to make the world better. It's that moment when you're a child and you notice that there are bad things happening in the world, and it's just kind of that awakening almost, and realizing that, wow, things are actually harder and worse out there than I assumed, and it's just a boy trying to right that and trying to make the people around him happy. And that's all I can really say about this book. But yeah, I enjoyed it so much. I can see why this is Kat, the person who put this up for a round robin, why it is her favorite book. Like I said, it's got that kind of funny, witty, fantasy feel to it. Oh, Hitchhikers is a good example. It's got that sort of feel. And more recent, if you've read the Frugal The Frugal Wizard's Handbook to Surviving Medieval England by Brandon Sanderson. It's that sort of feel of fantasy. If I hadn't watched the show and I had been more surprised by everything, I may have even scored this higher, but there were so many clever things in this book, and like so many cool parallels drawn between religion or religious text and what was happening in the present day. Next, I want to talk about The Sun and the Void. This is the book that I DNF'd, but that I'm still counting as a book, because if you look at how much I read of this book, I think I read like 57% of it, and I just could not read it anymore. I am not someone who DNFs easily. I will almost always try and stick it out. I think mostly because I really can't bear not to see how something plays out. As someone who writes myself, I feel like this is graft. This is like someone's very, very hard work, like blood, sweat, and tears went into making this book. And I feel bad not finishing something. So that is sort of just my way of saying that it takes a lot for me to DNF. This one had such great potential. It draws from South American folklore. We have ancient gods in this. We have different races. Some have like antlers, some have tails. I really liked the world building of this, and I think the world building was actually done okay, but I felt like it very often tipped into info dumping. So much information. The funny thing about this book is that it starts off really fast paced. We have this like action scene that is so intense and shows us so much instantly about this world. And I was so intrigued and drawn into this. I wanted to know more. I wanted to see how things played out for this character. Then we switch POV as well, and I think that was maybe an issue I had with this book, and I'm sure it comes together in the end, maybe, hopefully. But the stories were so different between the two POVs that it felt like two books. It felt to me like we were telling one story, then we were yanked out of that story, thrown into another one. And we kept doing that. There were real tangents in this book. We would be talking about something that didn't feel relevant to the story for so many pages. The pacing of this was off. I wasn't really investing in the characters. Actually, I felt like they didn't offer a lot. They didn't bring anything. What started out being a really intriguing character, I felt like she just didn't have agency. Like everything she did because she was instructed to do so. And I'm sure that that would change. But I feel, and I strongly feel, that if I've read 300 pages of a book, I want to see some growth. Like, I want to see something happening with that character. I wanted to move somewhere, do something. And I felt like this was stagnant. I thought it had potential to be fresh and to be epic, because the story that it is setting up does feel pretty epic. It has creatures and it has dark magic, and it has like this idea that someone will be able to ask a favor of the gods. And there were so many things that I wished were just executed in a way that really drew me in. I might be in the minority, because I have seen people talk about this book and really love it, say that it is beautiful and rich and imaginative, and it is imaginative. Something was lacking here. There was something that just didn't convince me, and that's fine. It might just be that this book isn't for me, but it felt clumsy. It could have done with just being edited down. There were big chunks of this narrative that I didn't think was necessary to the story. I also had an issue with where we kind of set up this character to be really important to the story, and then they would just disappear for whatever reason, like whether they die, they were taken, but they just vanish. I guess the question I just kept asking with this was, why did you spend so much time on a character that just wouldn't have any impact on the story? It was just small things like that where they all kind of added up to make me feel like this wasn't going anywhere. And if I kept investing in it, there just wouldn't be a payoff. I'd probably give this a 2, just because I did DNF it, but I could see why some people would potentially like it. My second 5-star read of August was Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Lynn, and I have had this book on my TBR for so long. As I was reading, I kept questioning why I hadn't read it sooner. It is beautiful, and I love this book for various reasons. One being the writing style, as you'd kind of imagine, something that draws a lot on Asian folklore and myth. This is really kind of poetic and lyrical in writing, and I love that. It suited the story so well. We kind of take the myth of Chang'e, who is the moon goddess, who was a mortal once, and she had a mortal lover who was a great archer, and her ascension to immortality and essentially becoming the moon goddess. But we focus instead on her daughter, who is Xingyin, and how she is cast out from her home and has to kind of make her own way. And what we see throughout the story is her determination to get back to her mother, and more specifically, like, free her mother. And that story and plotline alone was so beautiful to me. I think her constant loyalty to her mother and her cause was really, really intriguing. I have a thing with love triangles. I do not like them, but this was the first book where I loved this dynamic, and I think that largely comes down to the fact that main character Jingye isn't boy crazy. It's not just about choosing between these boys. It is about her loyalty to her mother and her loyalty to herself and wanting to prove herself. She is such a fierce character, and I think the fact that she kept this promise to her mother as like the thing that drives her, that made me not hate the love triangle, because it was secondary. It was a cherry on the top. It was just like a cool subplot that we could dive into, even though the boys do play a big part in her story, so that it's not like they don't matter specifically. They respectively contribute to her story and how she moves throughout the story, but I think her feelings for them is very much kind of secondary, and that's what I really loved about it. We see her take on so many roles throughout this. She is a determined scholar, she is a great fighter, she becomes a phenomenal archer, which is so beautiful and like a nod to her parentage, because obviously her dad was a great archer. And we see her strive to gain favor with the Celestial Emperor so that she can essentially exchange that for a favor, and that favor being the freedom of a mother. And it's just beautiful. I just really, really love the story, and I think even as I was reading it, I was really enjoying it. As I put it down, I knew I loved it and I knew I would give it a 5-star. But the more time that passes between me finishing this, the more it grows on me. It's just a beautiful book, and it's so fast paced. We have 3 parts, and the first part pretty much covers like her childhood or like young adulthood. And then we go into adulthood, and then we go past that kind of what feels almost more present in a way. There's so much action. It's infused with like Asian myth and Asian folklore, and it was just beautiful. I think if you read and loved something like The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea, you'd love this. And I cannot now wait to read the second book. I want to see how we kind of continue on. I did feel as though this book came to like a satisfying ending, so I am kind of intrigued to see how we move on. But I think book 2 might include a lot of redemption, but we'll need to see. Love triangle, friends to lovers, betrayal. There were dragons, which loved it so much. The final book I finished in the month of August was The Bands of Mourning by Brandon Sanderson, and this is the 3rd book in the Wax and Wane Mistborn cycle. You may or may not know that I'm trying to do a Cosmere reread. That was one of my reading goals for the year. I'm not doing very well. As you can tell, I've only read like 3 books, because I am also not reading the first 3 Mistborn books, which is the Vin books, because they're so fresh in my memory and I cannot go through that again yet. So I started on The Alloy of Law, and I've only read 3. I think it's because I have read these, I keep pushing them to the back of the list, and every time I run out of time, I'm like, it's fine because I've read this book before, so I'll just finish it off next month. And it just keeps getting pushed and pushed and pushed. And so I've ended up in September and only read 3 in my Cosmere reread. The first time I read these, which was immediately after reading the Vin cycle, I don't think I appreciated them as much as I should have. I think they were sort of, I don't know, I felt like they didn't feel like a good enough consolation prize for like all of the trauma I felt with the first 3 books. And so I kind of just didn't like them as much as I did this time around. This is set, I don't even know how many years after the first 3 books. Now we're sort of in like Victorian era in the 1800s or so. It's kind of like this almost like steampunk feel to it, but then there's also a Western element. We have this Mistborn Wax, who now has come from like the roughs that is almost like the Wild West, and he has to be a sophisticated gentleman, and he's just really struggling to do that. But what I love so much about these books is the magic system. Brandon Sanderson, one thing he does among many, but one thing he does really, really well is magic. He has such a complex feel to the system. There are so many rules and kind of things that you can do and not do. He always writes magic that has limits, and I really love that about magic. Like anytime I feel like magic is unlimited and you can just do what you want to do, it immediately feels like the stakes aren't that high for me then, because this person is pretty much unbeatable. Whereas with this magic system, like you need to consume certain metals to activate your magic. Without consuming that, obviously you wouldn't be able to tap into that magic. It immediately adds like a little extra layer of danger, because what if you end up in a situation where you're running out of metals and you cannot use your magic? So having a Western lawman who has that magic, and obviously a lot of enemies, and he's also trying to like fit in with like sophisticated society, is just like a really great like plot for me already. If you throw in like all of the other characters, I love pretty much every character in this. Wayne, who is his wacky sidekick, his commitment to like his bits is just insane. If anyone ever wanted to know how to do method acting, Wayne is your guy. Like he is so good at it, and I really enjoy them. The first time I read these as well, Steris, which is a love interest in this book, I just wasn't on board with Steris, and this time I appreciated her so much. She is such a good character. She is so precise and like such a perfectionist, and she has all of these lists and she wants to be so prepared for everything, and then throwing her into situations where you cannot prepare for those things is really interesting to see how she reacts. If I had to rate the books, this third one was probably my favorite so far. The first few books are referenced in this, but we also kind of see how those characters, who were obviously very human to us because we read the books as they were happening and as they lived these experiences, how they in this feel so like mythic. They start to feel like these untouchable gods almost. I also love the situations where they were thrown into a room together, which I actually touched on in my hyped videos, which I'll link above if you want to go and check that out. But I was basically talking about how in Six of Crows we have these situations where the crows are together and they're bantering, and they must come across completely unhinged to people on the outside, but to them they seem perfectly normal. And it's kind of the same with this crew, like so out there, especially because their personalities are so very different as well. They must look like complete lunatics to people on the outside, but to them they're perfectly normal, and to us watching chaos unfold, and it's really funny. I might make a video where I talk about this as a series. Two things I didn't end up finishing before the month caught up with me was our classic read, which was To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. But my friend also didn't finish, so we kind of agreed that we would just continue reading throughout the month of September and then do a catch-up call at the end of September discussing Mockingbird and Dracula. But something that I've already noticed just from being like 50 pages in is that it feels so nostalgic to me, and it actually made me feel quite like emotional, because a lot of it reminded me so much of childhood, things that I'm already enjoying about it a lot more than the first time I read it. The second thing I didn't finish was an audiobook of Half a King by Joe Abercrombie. and I'm not too sure how I feel about this yet. There are parts of it that I'm liking, but then overall I think I'm not like completely drawn in by it. It's not that I do not like epic fantasy, because I do, but the political epic fantasy, I'm not like the biggest fan of it. So even something like Game of Thrones, I'm sorry, I think even it's like the political intrigue and that it's this big strategic play for power. It's more the brutality of it. It's something I kind of struggle with. I think I'm quite thick-skinned, but I'm not a huge fan of gore, and especially like excessively so. I think that's quite the case with Half a King, but there's something about it that I'm not quite getting on board with yet. But in saying that, there are parts of it, there's especially like a found family dynamic that I'm starting to see develop at the moment that I am quite enjoying. And it's actually reminding me a little bit of Stormlight Archive and where Kaladin is with his Bridge 4 squad. I might still change my mind on it, but I'm not 100% sold on it just yet. So with all of that being said, I have not yet decided on my pick of the month for August. It is definitely between my two 5 stars. So it'll either be Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Fairies or Daughter of the Moon Goddess. So this is kind of where I want to ask your opinion.